organization, and not singly, but principally. I want to acknowledge Patsy George and invite her up to say a few words about this annual lecture that happens only because of a bequest from the Richard Splane family.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to give you a background of Dr. Richard B. Splane on this annual public event. But I also want to thank the Musqueam Nation for giving us this opportunity to gather in their unceded ancestral territories and continue to work for reconciliation. Dr. Splane was born in Calgary, educated at McMaster University, Toronto, and London School of Economics. After serving as a pilot during the Second World War, he became an assistant deputy minister with the federal government. As an expert on social policy, he chose the route to public service and academic work and to make Canada a better place for ordinary people, for the poor, the young families, people with disabilities, seniors, unemployed, and newcomers to Canada. His arguments for better wages, the unemployment insurance, and the responsibility of the government to take leadership in making it all happen were revolutionary in those days. He was a chief proponent of the Canada Assistance Plan, which provided 50% of the funds to the provinces for health, education, and social services. Those were the days. In addition to the significant contributions to the development of the national welfare system, he was involved internationally as Canada's representative on the UNICEF board and as a member of the UN expert group on social welfare policy and planning. In 1973, Dr. Splane was recruited by UBC School of Social Work, where he served until his retirement in 1982 as a professor of international development with special interest in Global South. His community service included leadership positions with Social Planning and Research Council of BC, Mosaic, World Federalist Movement, BC Association of Social Workers, and of course, United Nations Association Canada. He actually recruited me to be on the board of UNAC Vancouver. In retirement, he wrote 3 books, and a 4th one, together with his wife, Dr. Verna Splane, after visiting 55 countries in the Global South. He was recognized with several honorary doctorates and, of course, the Order of Canada. When Dick turned 90 years old, the UNAC Vancouver, together with UBC and other partners, decided to honor him by hosting an annual lecture on social policy in his name. Thus, the first lecture started in 2007. And here we are, meeting on the 19th year. Until his death in 2015, at the age of 100, Dick blessed us with his presence and encouragement, and even hosted a dinner at his home for those of us who are on the planning committee, together with the speaker of the day. We have focused on a number of policy areas in this lecture series, namely immigration, multiculturalism, poverty eradication, rights of Indigenous people and reconciliation, homelessness, policies to protect children and advocate for them both locally and globally, hunger and food security issues, guaranteed income, climate change issues, and many more. Dick believed in engaging the public, specifically students, in social policy issues, where issues of human rights, social justice, and peace are discussed. He truly believed that we can and we must influence the public policy development. In 1964, when I first met him as a social work student, he took the time to tell me that economic development without social development will not bring equality and justice. Thanks to him, that I served as the president of the International Council on Social Welfare, which took me to several UN-sponsored conferences, and served as a member of the Canadian delegation to the preparatory committee meeting in New York to plan for the Beijing Conference on Women. Today's topic, therefore, is very important to me personally, as it is a follow-up by the UN Security Council and the work the international women's community did in Beijing, Article 1325. Splane's legacy will remain, and it is now upon us to continue the battle under these very difficult circumstances. Welcome to the 19th Annual Richard Beverly Splane Lecture on Social Policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patsy. And I was somewhat negligent in introducing Patsy. I should have said Dr. Patsy George, because Patsy holds an honorary doctorate from UBC, among her many other orders, Order of Canada among them. And actually her honorary, or the way in which she's been honored in this country, are too numerous for me to list because I'm going to forget them. Anyways, for us, she's well loved and much respected, both for the commitment she gives to this lecture, but also for her world-famous carrot cake, which people seem to have devoured. It seems like it's gone. But apparently it was Richard Splane's favorite, and Patsy made it for him every year on his birthday. So we get the wonderful experience of having it at his lecture. I'm going to turn the mic over to Lauren Farmer, who's going to chair our panel discussion, and we'll have questions after. Thanks very much.
Actually, I have a mic here, but do you want me to give this to panelists? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Patsy, for welcoming us, and welcome everybody again, both in person and online. My name is Lauren, and I'm the co-president of the United Nations Association of Canada, the Vancouver branch. And outside of UNAC, I'm also a program manager. I work at CBC, where I support the implementation of the organization's first national Indigenous strategy, which is aimed at advancing reconciliation, Indigenous inclusion, and representation. So today, I have the pleasure of moderating a panel. You can't hear me? How do I?
Should she take the mic?
Does this?
Better done. We're designed for men's shirts.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Is that better? Oh, I can just hold it like that. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating, that is much better, thank you, a panel discussion on women, peace, and security as we mark the 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. When this resolution was adopted, I'll just give a bit of context and then I'll introduce the panelists. So when this resolution was adopted in October 2000, it set a global precedent. It was the first international recognition that sustainable peace and security cannot be achieved without the meaningful inclusion of women and without addressing the gendered impacts of conflict. This anniversary arrives at a moment of profound global uncertainty, with rising authoritarianism, ongoing armed conflict, and increased military spending, and the acceleration of impacts of climate change, all alongside a growing backlash against gender equality and human rights. So this anniversary challenges us to ask some difficult questions, such as, are the commitments made under the Women, Peace, and Security agenda keeping pace with today's realities? And how do we move from rhetoric to accountability? To help us explore these questions, we are honored to be joined by three very inspirational women whose work shapes peace and security efforts locally, nationally, and globally. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First is Katrina Leclerc. She is a multi-award winning peace builder, published researcher, and globally recognized specialist on the intersections of women, peace, and security, and youth, peace, and security. Katrina is a part-time professor at St. Paul University and a sessional lecturer at the University of Winnipeg. Welcome. Next, we have Dr. MacKenzie, who is the Simons Chair in International Law and Human Security at Simon Fraser University and co-director of the Canadian National Research Network on Women, Peace, and Security. She is known for her work on gender war and reimagining security beyond militarism. Welcome as well. And last but not least, we have Ellen Woodsworth, who is the co-chair of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada, an active writer with Quirky, founder and matriarch of Women at Transforming Cities, a former Vancouver City Councillor, and long activist using an intersectional lens. Welcome as well. Thank you all for being here. We're so grateful that you could join us, and I'm so honored to sit up here with you, especially as a woman. I'll begin by asking you a couple of questions, and then we'll leave time at the end for the audience, and then we'll go to questions from our online audience as well. So my first question, and maybe we'll start here and then go forward, but we'll mix it around a little bit. But my first question for the panel is, how does the UN resolution on women, peace, and security remain relevant in your work today? And you can use the mic if you want. It's a big question. But.
Thank you so much. And before I begin, thank you for the invitation, for having me come from Treaty 1 territory to join you here today. I flew in last evening from our prairies in Canada, although I did and proudly am born and raised in British Columbia. As you heard, I have various different experiences with women, peace, and security, and I have to admit I'm quite excited to be able to talk about some of these experiences, and most of them come because of the feminist mentorship, what I like to call femtorship, from elders and other leaders, thought leaders, and even young women from across the globe, in which I've had the opportunity and privilege, really, of being able to meet and work with over the last 10 and 15 years. And so what wasn't said is that I began my journey on women, peace, and security as a university student back in the day. And my professor was an international human rights lawyer. Her name is Mary MacDonald, and she was eventually appointed to the Senate of Canada. And I was very disappointed. And I said, Mary Lou, what am I going to do without you? We're going to have to end all of our work on women, peace, and security because now you have to go to our parliament. And she said, you're coming with me. And so I packed my bags and I flew and I went to Ottawa and I worked for her for 4 years, and we pushed for gender equality amendments into Canadian legislation. And one of the things, and I'm going back to your question, one of the things that I wanted to touch on, because I know this is part of also the conversation we want to be having today, is the rights of Indigenous women in our country. And they're not the only population or marginalized group that continues to fight for their rights and dignity, but it is a distinguished opportunity with the reflections we're having now, the 25th anniversary of Women, Peace, and Security, to think about our role and responsibility, both as settlers, but also perhaps newcomers, or perhaps members of certain communities that experience marginalization. And so when I was in the Senate, 1 month in, this bill was proposed because the court, a federal court, said that Canada was discriminating on sex-based, they were essentially experiencing sex-based discrimination through our current Indian Act, which is a colonial law that still reigns today. It was adopted first in the late 1800s and has been amended since, but continues to legislate how First Nation communities and Indigenous groups can govern their own affairs, if they can at all. And so we had before us a bill called S3, and we had women activists, Indigenous women activists, actually of many from British Columbia, calling us up and saying, we need allies. We need allies in the system. And I remember Sandra Lovelace Nicholas was sitting in the Senate, and she had won the case in the 70s and 80s against the government of Canada using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, telling the government that they were, in fact, discriminating against Indigenous women because they could not pass down their status if they had married out of their Indigenous communities. And of course, that was wrong, but our government wasn't recognizing it. And where I'm going with all of this is when we were presented with this bill, S3, we were told by these Indigenous women that we needed to amend it because, again, it was not adequately removing the sex-based discrimination. And this, in my opinion, is one of the ways that we could actually implement women, peace, and security principles in our ways of working in Parliament. Because women, peace, and security, yes, is a global policy framework. It's adopted by the world leaders. Canada was not a member of the Security Council necessarily, and every time there was a new resolution adopted, but we are a member of the United Nations, and therefore under Article 25 of the UN Charter are responsible to implement these resolutions. And so when these Indigenous matriarchs called up the Senate and said, we need your allyship, I was so incredibly proud that the senators gathered together cross-partisanly and responded. And they refused to pass a bill that continued to discriminate based on gender and sex of these Indigenous women and their lineage. And they won the fight against the House of Commons, who thought that that was sufficient. And the court kept telling them, no, go back, redraft, because this isn't good enough. And so going back to your original question, and I'll stop there. For me, women, peace, and security is more than just a policy framework. And although I've done a lot of work internationally, it has always inspired me, it's also part of the way we live our human rights principles. And so it's grounded in my thinking as a transformative agenda, one that doesn't go with the status quo because it's popular, but one that continuously asks us to rethink our systems. And I'm sure Ellen will talk about some of this because we've talked a lot about it through some of the civil society spaces we share. But I think the Women, Peace, and Security agenda can be implemented by any and all of us as citizens, especially those of us who are in this room who are looking at social policy, of course. But it has to be a set of guiding principles that go beyond only the ideas and the parameters that 1325 introduced 25 years ago.
Thank you.
I just want to start by saying thank you so much. Thanks everyone for attending this event, and thank you to Donna for all of the team that co-organized and organized this event. And thank you so much, Patsy. I really loved the cake. I could feel the love that went into it. It's delicious, and I was eating it even as the panel started. So thank you. So for me, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda remains really an obvious part of my work. I co-direct a national network on women, peace, and security, and I've done that for the last year and a half, and I was part of the network for the previous 3 years beyond that. And this is a network that's actually funded by the Department of National Defense, and I think some scholars would feel like there's maybe some ethical dilemmas. We use that research funds, and much of the research I do is to help students think critically about military spending, and we work alongside Department of National Defense, Canadian Armed Forces members to really hold them accountable to their commitments around the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. And so it's been a really meaningful and eye-opening experience. We also really foster and really try and support future leaders in women, peace, and security. And I guess for me, and especially in this moment, I want to highlight, I do think the Women, Peace, and Security agenda can seem a little abstract to many people. It's so many different resolutions. It's kind of a broad agenda. It can mean a lot of different things. And so for me, the part of the agenda I'm really interested in is the peace part of it. And I think it often is the part that gets left off. And I like to really emphasize, I organized a workshop a couple of years ago called Where is the Peace in Women, Peace, and Security? And we really tried to recenter the fact that this was an agenda that was largely driven by women from the global south. And they weren't just interested in sort of highlighting how war is terrible for women. They wanted to end global conflict. They wanted to shift funds away from militarized spending towards social goods. And I think that's why it's such an interesting and important topic for this lecture series for someone who was so committed to social welfare, to sort of recenter that element. And so a couple of things that I do to sort of recenter disarmament. I do some work with MV Ramana, who's here at UBC, and Jennifer Simons around nuclear disarmament education, trying to help make sure that that's still on the agenda, that we kind of counter these narratives that nuclear weapons are some sort of assurance of security or signal of power. And I teach a course on gender and security, and I also run what I call a dream lab. I've done that a couple of years now, and DREAM in this instance stands for Defense Resources Exploring Alternatives to Militarism. And it really is a chance for us to get together, us, I mean me and students that apply to the program. It's outside of coursework. And we take defense budgets and we think about how we would rather spend that money. And we really try and also make defense budgets accessible. So what could we spend? What else could we do with money spent towards F-35s, for example? So I have students actually take those numbers and translate them into grocery bills, into how many individuals could have a month of free treatment for addictions. And it really helps students to get excited about imagining alternative futures, first of all, because I think that skill gets deadened by our news, and even for myself, it is very hard to stay positive. And Donna, thank you for starting by sharing how you were feeling, because I think we all carry those deep emotions. It is a very difficult time. So for me, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the rhetoric. So I selfishly created the Dream Lab partly to keep myself refocused and keep myself focused on that hope focus. But I do think women, peace, and security, because of its roots in disarmament and its roots in the aspirations for peace, remain even more important than ever.
I would be remiss if I didn't say that John Price and I were the co-founders of the World Peace Forum, and we had no money. I was on council, John was on the Peace and Justice Committee. So we went and visited Dr. Simons and said, we've got this idea of a World Peace Forum that get the whole city engaged with. She said, sure, how much do you want? And that's how we were able to pull that off. But that's why I want you to take my advice. So I think we live in very dangerous times. I think we all know this. We're all afraid. There's real reasons to be afraid. And it's critical for world peace to have an agreed upon international gender intersectional statement that educates, empowers, unites countries, organizations, NGOs, and people around the world. Most people in the world today are looking at the U.S. warmongering with total immunity as it gets more and more serious. And what doesn't get talked about very much is women's peace and security or the environmental impact. Our Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was set up in 1910 and has offices in Geneva and in New York and advocates at the UN, we decided to come up with a slogan, and you're welcome to a button that says demilitarize, decarbonize, and decolonize. We have active organizations in 40 countries in all 6 areas of the world. We've developed a toolkit with recommendations for developing women, peace, and security national action plans. 20 years later, the Wealth UN Security Council 1325 stated, despite the many normative frameworks to advance gender equality, 10 World Women Peace Security resolutions, and countless commitments by member states, we still live in a world with rampant armed conflict and instability, where women are disproportionately impacted, whether before, during, or after a conflict. There's a double-faced approach at play within the UNSC, where states continue to reaffirm the importance of implementing the WPS commitments while also spending tens or hundreds of billions per year on their militaries, producing and exporting arms, resisting ratifying arms control treaties, taking contradictory actions on denuclearizations. Resolution 1325 has been turned into a framework that is utilized to make war and conflict safe for women rather than preventing or ending war and conflict. Militarism is one of the biggest obstacles standing in the way of the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and achieving feminist peace. The consultations reveal three interrelated themes.
Howdy, howdy.
Women, peace and security implementations. Militarism and militarism.
So you want the car by what time?
Political undermining of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Accountability for women, peace and security implementation. Disarmament and demilitarization are starkly absent from debates on and implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Resolution 1325 is still seen as a framework that only concerns conflict-affected countries. The narrow and militarized definitions of conflict, peace, and security directly impede root cause analysis. Conflict prevention is largely absent in debates on and implementation of the WPS agenda. Adding women into armed structures of power, specifically the military and peacekeeping operations, has become a major focus in WPS implementation. In her critical appraisal of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Zeynep Kaya says, WPS agenda embodies some key tensions which undermine its potential. It is an agenda with one foot planted in traditional security conceptions and structures and the other in transnational and feminist peace activism. It is caught between an urge to reflect existing international power structures and normative frameworks and the desire to eliminate or at least reduce gender inequalities and include women in peacekeeping. Although the Women, Peace, Security Agenda is widely welcomed by feminist scholars and activists, it does not represent feminist peace and feminist security, mainly because of its dual position of being both an agenda for feminist women and for the UN Security Council. Wilf has exposed the fact that the US has 12,000 nuclear weapons and military bases around the world, including 3 nuclear bases situated in countries encircling China, while its own people are hungry. A huge disproportionate number of black people are in jail, and we watch horrified as hundreds of thousands of immigrants and refugees are rounded up, put in jail, or deported. Indigenous issues are ignored, and EDI, trans, and queer rights are torn up and people attacked. Behind this insane U.S. president is Project 2025 and the map of their plans, which were developed by the billionaires. Project 2025 is a must-read to understand what is happening in the USA. Now, I could keep going. I don't know when you would like me to stop, but I think that there's been a number of actions that WILF has taken to address what's happening in the world today, whether it's Palestine, Sudan, Ukraine, Greenland, and Iran, requiring us to speak out. And we have a statement about Iran, protests in Iran. But we oppose the U.S. president and his government warmongering and arresting the president of Venezuela and openly talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. We have launched a campaign called Move the Money. It is against war and militarism and for peace, which states that in 2024, global military expenditures were $2.7 trillion. Meanwhile, funding for peace, gender equality, social justice, and climate action is being cut. So our key demands at COP30, and I have a flyer about the full list of demands, were peace and demilitarization for peace and climate justice, reallocation of military spending to climate finance, accelerate an equitable fossil fuel phase out. So I think we have to look at the fact that the Canadian government is increasing the military budget to 49 billion and then planning it to have it up to 50 billion, cut 2.7 billion for foreign aid, cut spending for women and gender equality, which funds thousands of women, queer, and Indigenous programs, and has stated that it will eliminate it in 5 years. It's cut immigration refugee programs, proposed a northern pipeline on Indigenous peoples' lands, overriding the majority of Indigenous organizations. The 2S LGBTQIA+ rights are under attack. Provincial and local programs like EDI, affordable housing, childcare, public education, health, and Indigenous rights are being dismantled or reduced, just like they said they would do under NAFTA. Poverty is growing at a rapid pace, many just one check away. It's very important at this point that we get together in groups like this and identify what's happening when our Prime Minister stands up to the President, but he still proposes to proceed with the global corporate agenda just with the middle power states and dismembers the concepts of cooperation and public programs that my parents fought for and this School of Social Work has fought for in many years. We need to work with organizations to discuss what we want to do, and we need to get together with each other so we can do it together.
Thank you all for sharing your perspectives, for setting the stage and how you're doing to advance this important issue, and for sharing a bit about your stories as well. A few of you mentioned the topic of Indigenous matters and how this relates to Indigenous people, and so I just want to shine a little bit more of a light on that matter in particular, and looking inward at the Canadian situation at the national scale. So my second question for you is reconciliation, safety, and justice for Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people are inseparable from any meaningful WPS agenda. So how do you think that Canada should demonstrate commitment to implementing the calls for justice for or from the missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited plus inquiry as part of their WPS obligations? We started with you, so maybe we can start with you, Megan, this time, if you want.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think the fact that one of our panelists can't be here because of femicides and because of the violence that is happening in our communities is really an indictment on where the WPS agenda is being furthered here in Canada. And I really think it's important to just really sit with that for a minute. I do think that often the WPS agenda is treated by Western states, including Canada, as if it's an agenda that we exercise out there as authorities, and it's a colonial mentality that comes from and mimics the kind of colonial mentality that exists internally. And so too often it's framed, it's not only inaccurate, but it reproduces colonial assumptions about insecurity and who provides security. So two things that get lost when WPS is treated as only external or something we do out there. First, as mentioned earlier, the WPS agenda was pushed forward largely by women from the Global South as an agenda for peace, disarmament, and also redefining security in terms of human security, a broader definition of security, safety, well-being. Not as a narrow set of programs that where wealthy countries exert, and not as a program of adding more women to peacekeeping forces or adding more women to defense organizations. So second, framing WPS as something we only do out there also ignores that Western states, including Canada, contain deep patterns of gendered insecurity and violence. And a WPS agenda that doesn't apply at home is simply not credible. So I do think Canada can't claim leadership on WPS while Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people face long-standing and ongoing insecurity, including disproportionate violence, neglect, a justice system that's often failed to protect, investigate, or respond, and genuine commitment to the calls for justice from missing, murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit inquiry means confronting the root causes, not only symptoms of insecurity. So that would include, but not entirely, a short list would include sort of the long-term, identifying and addressing the long-term insecurity produced by land theft, dispossession, and stolen generations, the impacts of ongoing systemic racism in policing, courts, and social services, patterns of over-policing in some contexts and failures to act in others, including cases where clear evidence of violence was ignored, and the broader erosion of safety and well-being created by state policies and chronic underinvestment. So I think a meaningful WPS approach has to also recognize that Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people are not just vulnerable populations. They are leaders, organizers, experts on safety and insecurity and how to advance their own safety and security and how to define that. Women have, in particular, have often been at the forefront of land back movements, efforts to enhance community well-being, and justice work. So I think we need to really center those individuals, listen to them when they tell us what their forms of insecurity are, include them and have them be leaders in these discussions on women, peace, and security, and also keep bringing that idea of the agenda as a domestic agenda.
How should Canada act? Implement the recommendations. I mean, I think it's 2 or 3 of the recommendations from the 2S Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls document that have been acted on. But I think the best way to say it would be to acknowledge people like Bernie Skundal and Gladys Raggett, the Walk for Justice sisters. And Gladys has one leg amputated at her knee. They first walked to Prince George. Since then, they've walked across Canada several times, raising the issues of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. We must support and fund their work, so I hope you'll all join me February 14th, noon at Carnegie Community Center, when we'll all walk together, thousands and thousands of people gathered. And we need to put pressure on the city government as well, because there's now $7 million more dollars into the police force. What about housing? What about shelters? What about the wish funding that was cut? What about the affordable SROs that just got cut out of the DEO division? So these are the kinds of things that Bernie Skundal, as she's nicknamed, and Gladys raise as they walk across Canada and try to get action on the various proposals in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and in the TRC recommendations. I think within that we have to get affordable housing on or off reserve, transit, affordable transit, social services, water, and food on your reserves. We have to deal with violence, and we have to talk about this new proposed pipeline across Canada that has not been agreed upon by many First Nations people. And in many of these sites where this kind of development happens, there's an extreme level of violence and women go missing. I also highly recommend, Senator Kim Pate has just come out with a document, and she's focusing on incarcerated women and girls and men. And she said it's the greatest impact on women, 22% since 2019, despite a decline for non-Indigenous women by 11%. And she specifically recommends Bills 205 move us into a more supportive situation. We could reduce the numbers, and we could allow bills to expire and allow judges to file minimum sentences. And I think then the other thing that really strikes home to me is the serious lack of Indigenous representation at the federal, provincial, or local levels. And one of the things that Britannia Community Center did recently, which I think is such a practical what they set forward, they made 3 seats on the board for Indigenous people. And I think we should be doing that at all levels of government so that, the issues of that are coming forward from urban Aboriginal people aren't allocated to either BC municipalities or some other body that's very, very removed from the situations. So I'll pass it over.
Thank you both. I've already touched a little bit on this question, but I want to add to what Megan was saying around this domestication of the agenda. So one of the things that is not in my bio, but is something that I am currently contributing to, is the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada. So it's a civil society platform. We are a registered organization, but we operate as an exchange platform to be able to coordinate advocacy and also to monitor and engage with the government of Canada, specifically at the federal level, but nothing stops us from going at other levels of governance, to be able to hold our government accountable for their commitments to women, peace, and security, but also their responsibilities towards women, peace, and security. And so the reason why I keep looking at Ellen is because WILP is, of course, a member of this network, and this is why Ellen and I get to work together in certain opportunities in advocacy. And we work closely also now with the Research Network, which is an academic network. And so where I'm going with this is the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada was created now more than 15 years ago through civil society activism and mostly women's activists who gathered and said, we need a platform to be able to exchange because the government is not taking us seriously. And at the time, there was no document adopted by our federal leadership that actually demonstrated through a policy what women, peace, and security commitments would be. And so some of the civil society advocacy was organized primarily at the time when the Harper government was in power, and you can suspect that women, peace, and security wasn't the most popular priority of the Harper government. But nonetheless, the Harper government adopted what we call a National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. And National Action Plans have become the standard, the golden standard of how to implement women, peace, and security at a national level. Now, if I believe that, that's a different question. But it has become recognized, and now 115 countries across the world have at least one version of a National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. It doesn't matter if you're in a Western nation, if you're a conflict-affected nation. In theory, you should all have a National Action Plan. And so when this started happening, of course, the Harper government did not adopt a National Action Plan that was very introspective, as you can expect, and was very much around the discourse that Megan was describing of what Canada can do abroad. And so the Women, Peace and Security Network, with some Indigenous allies, decided that we were going to focus some of this advocacy. I say we, but I can't appropriate that leadership. I was not there at the time. But they decided in the early days that they needed to mobilize and document, right? Document why and how women, peace, and security should be contextualized in our nation. And a lot of that is the experience and the colonial legacy that continues to be experienced by our Indigenous sisters and mothers and aunties and friends. And so this idea of domestication of the agenda, or the introspective understanding and humility exercise that it demands, was part of the advocacy that this network and these matriarchs really did over the years. Now we are at our third National Action Plan. Okay, so we've had a first under the Harper government. Trudeau's government came in 2015. Our National Action Plan was coming to an end. They adopted a second one in 2017. And they started looking at slightly what it would look like inside our boundaries, our borders. And so one of the things that civil society started to do with academic allies is advocate for government departments that were not just global affairs or the Department of Defense to look at women, peace, and security and take it seriously. And so through the second and now the third, which was adopted in 2023, National Action Plan, there are now department-specific plans. So each of the departments who sign on to the National Action Plan are responsible to make a specific department plan. And now we have 10 different ministries at the federal level who have specific mandated plans, including both Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations departments. And that means that they've integrated in their plan the MMIWG recommendations from the inquiry. Now again, the question remains, is that just beautiful words on paper, or does that actually get implemented? And part of that is also the responsibility to socialize this understanding of what our public policy is, because this exists. And I would assume several of you in this room are hearing this perhaps for the first time, that we have this document that exists, these ministries who've committed, they've committed funds, actually, in addition to just the pretty words on paper, but most Canadians are not aware. And that, I think, is one of the downfalls that we have of living in a perceived peaceful state, because we don't need to look further than our everyday opportunities or challenges. Whereas in conflict-affected nations, it is overtly in your face. And so I think, and then I'll pass the mic over, I think it's our individual and collective responsibility to socialize this understanding. And it comes down to all of us being allies towards each other and to others who are experiencing discrimination in different and multifaceted ways.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing your insights, all, and that's a really useful framing of what's happening at the national level and reframing how we can look at the WPS agenda more internally. So we've looked a bit about how the WPS resolution stays relevant in your work. We've looked at the national scale, and I want to end my questions by looking ahead. So I'm wondering, can you share some of your ideas on future priorities and maybe directions for our shared work on women, peace, and security? If you have a call to action, you can say a call to action. I wonder if we can start with you, Ellen.
My call to action is that I think we need a National Women's Peace Conference, whether we started at the local level first and then we build something like the World Peace Forum, but we need this urgently because the steps that the Prime Minister is taking now means massive cuts to social spending, cuts to the wage, cuts to affordable housing, privatization of healthcare, not addressing the murdered Indigenous women and girls recommendations or the TRC recommendations, transit problem. All of that money is going out the window. In a couple of years, it'll be $150 billion going to NATO. $150 billion. And all of these pressing social issues that make Canada the nation that we want to live in means that I think the recent stat I saw, 1 out of 2 people are a paycheck away from poverty. Like, we're seeing serious crises in our society already, and we don't need the military-industrial complex getting richer and richer off the taxes we pay. But it means that we have to stand up and build peace coalitions. Wolf International created a campaign called Move the Money. Military spending is a political choice. Stop funding war, start funding peace. The time to act is now. We know that the United States has 12,000 nuclear weapons, that the top 5 military spenders were 60% of the global total. China's got 400, Russia's about 400, Germany and India have a few hundred, and Israel has about 200. All NATO members increased their military spending in 2024. Over 100 countries increased their military spending in 2024. And young people know what this means to the environment way better than I do. So the repercussions for proceeding in this way doesn't mean we stop the United States for invading Canada. We can't stop them militarily. But if we build peace organizations, we can do what the people in Minneapolis are doing. We can stand together and stand up to this militarization of our society. But we have to do it by saying no to the federal budget that's about to be passed. And we just, Wolf just had a meeting with Senator Wu, and he's getting together with other senators to see what they can do to speak out about it. But we really have to examine the direction that the current government, although I'm glad it's a liberal one at this point, but they are acting not for the greater good, but for the corporate good. and we have to face that and decide what we will do together.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come in with a different angle, but I do agree with Ellen. I want to add from a foreign affairs perspective. So I've had the privilege of working in 36 different countries through the United Nations and work I do as a consultant for different UN entities and non-governmental organizations. And almost every single time I go elsewhere to develop social policy, to support working on women, peace, and security, I get asked, why is Canada so great, and how have we done so well, and how is our National Action Plan so robust, and how come we have these social infrastructures? And every time I am reminded, of the immense privilege, of course, that it is to be Canadian, but at the same time, I'm reminded that we often lose our way of being, or we lose that vision of what we want Canada to be. And I think we're in a moment where we may be losing that vision. And I think that to be able to truly say that we're implementing women, peace, and security, we truly have to stop and think and listen. And listen with humility, because many other countries are taking leadership in ways that we haven't seen or recognized before. And we are perceived to be a peaceful country. We experience general security in a very flat line understanding of security, but we cannot take it for granted. And I think Canadians, especially of my generation, or perhaps others, don't understand what violence could look like for Canadians, what we are contributing to elsewhere. And it's not enough to say that we are a peaceful country. We actually have to act that way. And so I think it's the individual responsibility of us as those who live in this territory to speak up and to step forward in solidarity with others who are doing this work. So joining, for example, a network, those of you who are students, joining the research network on women, peace, and security, joining the civil society network, looking up what these policies already mean and what they say, what does our government say, and seeing how you can popularize it in your own networks is already, in my opinion, a good first step.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think what I would add, I did have disarmament, and I was trying to say it politely, but I guess the one thing that I feel like those of us who've been paying attention to gender for a long time are pulling our hair out right now, because I think if you're trying to understand what's going on in global politics right now and you don't have a gender analysis, you really are not going to navigate your way through it. And so I do think part of what the WPS agenda asked is not just for us to add women, but to take seriously gender and also take seriously feminist analysis. And we really need that more than ever right now. I am sort of thinking about, I study militaries because I think militaries are the place where gendered norms in a particular place crystallize. And if we want to understand how patriarchy operates, we first look at the military, and those norms spill out into a society. And so I think back to, you may recall, some of you may be erasing news from your memory, and that's okay. I respect those strategies. But Pete Hegseth, who was like, if AI generated like my worst nightmare of a human being, I mean, it's truly, when he brought all of the senior leaders of the U.S. military together to sort of outline his plan, I think at least he was more overt and honest about what effectively is America's foreign policy, which is like, we will do whatever we want. And the whole FAFO, this unprofessional slogan, is actually what is happening right now. And so I think we can look at Pete Hegseth to understand the gendered politics of the kinds of toxic masculinity, the kinds of toxic leadership that is being embraced. And part of why everyone loved Carney's speech is that the bar is so low for professionalism right now. And that's not to say that there weren't some wonderful things. I especially loved his line, "Nostalgia is not a strategy." But what I would have loved him to say is masculinity nostalgia is not a strategy. This idea of a better time when men were men and we could go back to a time when there was no DEI, there were no women in the military. This is actually a masculinity nostalgia. And so leaving out a white masculinity nostalgia, but leaving out that gender analysis and just having some like Thucydides trap and power balance, like just it is no longer relevant. And so I think that has to just be something, when I hear someone doing an analysis of what's going on without gender, I actually just cannot handle it anymore. And I think we should really hold experts accountable to thinking carefully about not just where women are and vulnerable populations, but a feminist analysis of politics.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that we had for you tonight. There were so many important nuggets of things to chew on there. I want to highlight a couple. I heard a lot about centering Indigenous women and their voices in this space, holding leaders accountable, pushing the agenda and some blocks to doing so, reframing the women, peace, and security agenda as an internal one as well, and our perceived state as a peaceful one, listening with humility, a lot of calls to action, and the patriarchal lens on military. So thank you so much. Can we just give everybody a round of applause? We'll now transition to questions from the audience. So if you just want to raise your hand, I can call on you. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Are there any questions online? Well, is there anything that's top of mind for you that you think? Oh, yep, thank you.
How do we get there tomorrow?
I don't know.
No, but online.
Oh.
If people want buttons, there's a whole bunch of buttons just over the table. Peace buttons or all kinds of buttons.
So you mentioned that kind of a way to look at when that gender inequity is present is kind of first see what's happening in the military. I work in anti-trafficking, and I'd also say look at what's happening in human trafficking, and it is on the rise. And that is kind of that telltale sign of gendered inequity. And pretty much everything that you said also goes into it. Like you spoke about the pipeline, and there's stats everywhere that show where there are these work camps, and especially where Indigenous land is colonized, that Indigenous bodies are colonized as well. And that those are part of the calls for MMIWG, and kind of on. And we saw even in Ukraine that as people were leaving, that unfortunately traffickers were at those train stations trafficking folks right away. And in Canada, we sorry, this is my little soapbox, but I have a question. In Canada, we think, oh, well, this doesn't happen, but like 90% of trafficking in Canada is domestic. And that is something that people don't think about, because back to what you were saying, we think everything's so safe and everything's so bright and shiny. And so I wonder, when we see this sign of gendered inequity, what do we do? Not even so much on the world stage, but I wonder, what have we learned from the world stage of what we can do at home?
I have this tiny mic if you want to use that in your response.
I think that addressing the calls from the Two-Spirited Emergency Indigenous Women and Girls report are critical. So many of the missing women are Indigenous women, and the money is not there, the protection is not there. And that's why I think we should always join the February 14th March. But I think I also have to say the queer community is being targeted, and people are being attacked and beaten up, and DEI or EDI wording is being removed all over the United States, but also in Canada, Alberta. So violence is on the rise. The right wing is using racism and anti-Indigenous rhetoric to build their movements. And we have to, there is a city election coming up that we can influence, but there's also probably going to be a federal election coming. So we really need to think about some of these issues and how we want them implemented. Because if wage gets cut, which is what they're sounding like they're going to do, it means the violence is even more hidden and unaddressed.
I mean, it's such a big question, and I think it is I think it's a great question. It's a very overwhelming question, and I think that's people do get overwhelmed by it. I mean, gender inequity, patriarchy is so overwhelming. It's so powerful. It's so adaptive. I do think that if we can think into our local communities, because some of our fiercest advocates are tired and worn down, and thinking about how to keep queer kids safe at local schools, and thinking about the kinds of programming that exists on campus, for example, that is being erased, or where people are feeling vulnerable. I think all of those seem micro, but they're really important parts of a WPS agenda. So I think that's where I would start in your local advocacy. Don't let, even not letting, I think especially, as white women, not letting, using our privilege and not letting racist comments, not letting sexist comments. So all of those things that seem small in a moment are actually extremely important and are sort of the minimum thing we can be doing. So I think that's a good start.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you asked a little bit what we have learned on the world stage, and I unfortunately have to say I'm not sure we learned that much if you're looking at women, peace, and security, because the narrative and rhetoric has always been that Canada is a champion and among the best nations for women, peace, and security. And what I always remind myself and students or activists that I work with is we can't create and fall into the narrative of that hierarchy of suffering. And so we can't say that because we suffer perhaps less than someone who's in a war or a wartime moment, that we have nothing that we can aspire to. And so I think we have to remind ourselves that even if we have different realities, we can still continue to try and improve our social systems. And to add to what Megan was saying, I mean, now that I am at the end of my own PhD and starting to teach and work in universities, I've actively, consciously started co-publishing with local activists. Activists who don't have the same networks or opportunities that the institutions I now belong to offer me, for example. And so trying to leverage my personal privilege to be able to spend, this extra time and effort to work with these activists who honestly teach me so much, to be able to give them that platform. And again, we talk a lot about in Women, Peace, and Security about not having certain group who have more access speak on behalf of others. And I think that that's a general good feminist principle that's starting to finally be more normalized and socialized. And I think that that's part of what I'm trying to do, right? If you, instead of saying, well, I'm going to speak and share your story, and I'm going to publish about the young women in the DRC I've been working with, no, I'm going to co-publish and have their names on this piece of paper if they so choose, so that they can speak from their own authentic voice, and I can leverage my own privilege to give them that platform. And so that's a micro example that we can do as scholars or activists to try and bridge some of those gaps. Otherwise, some people don't have access to certain places.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
We
Yeah, I know. You got a microphone now.
Okay.
Yes, hi. Thanks very much to the panel for the very instructive comments and things that you've told us this evening. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your sense of what is going on abroad. During the 10 years after Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed in 2000, I was working in UN peacekeeping in a number of different missions in Africa. And the word came down very fast after the resolution was passed that we had to incorporate 1325 into our actions and plans. I was working particularly in communications, working with civilians in Liberia later in that decade. What I found was that, I mean, while the UN's adoption of 1325 was pretty glacial, sometimes it did seem to depend very strongly on the culture within the country where the particular peacekeeping was operating. In Sudan at the time, although it was relatively peaceful at that time, it was impossible to get any kind of action happening at a community level, a civilian community level, just because it seemed to be not part of the culture. In Liberia, on the other hand, with the first elected woman president in Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the Women's Colloquium that she organized I think it was in 2008, and the individual things like she encouraged the Indian government, who were major contributors of military to the peacekeeping operation in Liberia. She encouraged them to bring in the all women's formed police units, they were referred to. And on the various open days that we used to have in the mission, to bring in members of the public just to see how we operated and what we did, the most popular thing always was the formed police unit from India, women's formed police unit. So much so that there is now, Liberia now has its own all-women formed police unit. Young women students that we were bringing in were saying always, when they saw what the Indian women were doing in their police unit, they said, we've got to do the same in Liberia. And I think the success story is that now that they are actually doing that. One last thing I would say is that since I retired, came back to Canada, both my wife and I, who both worked in the UN and both worked in peacekeeping missions, have spent a lot of time talking at the high school level. And I think that listening to you tonight, I feel that there's a lot of good work being done, and it's being done at a quite senior level, certainly on an educational level, university level, postgraduate level. But the sense that I've had with so much of what Canada is doing and so much of what we stand for in this country, including the idea of women's peace and security, needs to come in at the lower level. It needs to come in at the high school level. You could see the light bulb going off over high school kids' heads, as it were, when you talk about these things. And I think that although we are doing great work at the graduate and postgraduate level, let's also concentrate on what we can do at a lower level. Thanks. And I'd be interested in your comments.
Could I speak?
I think that was a little bit because of the formation of the questions, because Wolf Canada did an On to Ottawa peace caravan. So we drove all the way across Canada talking and stopping and talking with students, and then we're invited to, we demonstrated in front of the CANSEC arms fair, and then we started getting invitations to go to schools, and one of the most exciting things was when we were invited to Nova Scotia with Voice of Women for Peace, and met a peace organization from India that walks thousands and thousands of miles for peace. And then we started to walk 200 kilometers for peace from Pugwash to Dalhousie, and stopping and talking to students in the schools. And they love the buttons. They want to know. They make the connections between military spending and the lack of affordable housing and all kinds of other things that their families need. And I think we there is a lot of stuff. There was the peace train that went across Canada just recently. People from, especially on the islands, were working on that. So people are doing things like that. You know, there's Women in Black I think it's every week in front of City Hall. There's ceasefire rallies. So there are many people doing things that don't get exposed that much. But I'm sure people could take the mic. Sally could take the mic and talk about some of those things.
Can I ask and I really appreciated, thank you, your intervention, and very interesting to hear your experience in the field. And one of the things I was referring to earlier when I was saying that I had worked in several different countries, including several in Francophone Africa actually, is through the question of how do you bring these international policies to something that is contextualized because they're global and that makes sense to everyday people. And a lot of it comes through the concept of localization. And the concept of localization, from my perspective, doesn't emerge from policy circles. It has been now adopted and used through the UN discourse, but at the end of the day, it came from the women activists again, who were the ones who pushed initially for women, peace, and security to be recognized, for women as a contingent to be recognized in context of peace and security. And what localization does is essentially it contextualizes the global policies to national ones, but even further in communities. And so they create local versions of action plans, perhaps. Sometimes they integrate the women, peace, and security principles in local development plans. Other times they develop local laws and ordinances, depending on the context of decentralization in different countries. And one example I like to cite because of the leadership that came from women's activists is in Colombia. Because across Latin America, governments at the federal level or their national level don't want to recognize that they experience peace or security concerns. And they don't like to qualify themselves as a post-conflict state, for example. Other than Colombia, who's the only country who can't really say no because they are ongoing again now a second peace process. It's a bit difficult to say, oh, well, we're not a post-conflict state if you're going through a legal process that recognizes that. But in Colombia, despite their peace processes, the national government did not want to adopt any sort of commitments on women, peace, and security up until only 3 or 4 years ago, when they finally, well, they had a change in government, that helps, but they finally were able to convince the federal or their national government to start developing a national action plan. And that is because of the actual switch that happened, where local community leaders, women's organizations primarily, peace organizations, were going to local communities, equivalent to municipal councils, and saying we want to develop local plans about this international framework because it's relevant to our realities. And so we want to contextualize it. And so they developed in 11 different districts, they're equivalent of our municipalities, local action plans. And it was a very big success, continues to be to this day, and that leadership is what puts so much pressure on their national government to do something at the national level. And so in this case, the activism came from the ground up, and it wasn't a parachuting of an international policy. It was very much something that these local activists were pushing. So going back to your culture change issue and the challenges that come with very ingrained culture and the fact that women, peace, and security to very large extents challenges cultural norms, in certain cases, this localization and appropriation of gender equality by the local activists and the communities is what is actually changing the national response. And so I like to cite the Colombia example because it demonstrates that it's not just about what the international community is expecting us to do, but sometimes it really does come from the people themselves.
Lauren, is it okay if we do just one last quick question?
Sure. And I think we also have one online, so maybe we can leave time for 2, but quick ones.
Yeah, you might want to take both and then they can.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your comments and the knowledge you shared. I really like how you mentioned the masculinity nostalgia, and it really resonates with me since I met multiple people like this in person, and they've been really against DEI in the workplace. And I was wondering what can be done to fight this for regular people like me, and maybe what kind of arguments would make the biggest impact?
Online one as well? Oh, sure. Should we say the online one next?
Sure.
Hello? Hello?
Thank you.
Hello? Hello?
Okay, we have a question online from Tamara. She asks, in the past 25 years, Canada has engaged in war operations that defy women, peace, and security, such as combat in Afghanistan, bombings in Libya, Syria, and Iraq, sending weapons to other countries, citing Ukraine and Israel, being involved in overthrow of the government of Haiti in 2004, participation in a coup in Ukraine in 2018. Cites this as all of this is Canadian militarism that has caused immense harm to women and girls in other countries. What are the panelists' thoughts about this? Is the federal government serious about women, peace, and security? Where is the accountability and justice? And she also noted that the government provides a lot of funding to the military, but not as much to research on such topics. So that's the question for them.
If you can answer the question.
Sorry. It's okay. Well, I'm happy to say that I do take Department of National Defense funding and use it to fund student exploration of how to spend military funds in ways that would promote peace. So there is Department of National Defense funding that is still dedicated towards research. I hope that continues through the Mobilizing Insights in National Defense and Security. This is very unique to Canada, and I do think we should be very proud of that fact that, when living in Australia for nearly 10 years, I had, similar expertise. I was very rarely contacted as an expert from government, and I do think there is still this interaction between experts and between researchers and Department of National Defense. I do think that there are committed members of the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces who care about women, peace, and security. That said, the reality of what women, peace, and security should look like versus the actualization, there's a gap. But I love your question about masculinity nostalgia, so I just want to say something about it. And of course, what you can say in those moments depends on your power in that moment. And I think you just have to be honest about it. So sometimes you don't have the power to sort of have a big moment with somebody who makes a statement about masculinity nostalgia. But what masculinity nostalgia, in my experience, often looks like is a very general statement that positions DEI, equity, efforts to advance marginalized groups as a bummer, a threat to their well-being, a threat to their power, and also this idea. There's often this idea of a before time when this sort of, often it's completely misguided. It's sort of a fantasy, right? And so I think the best thing you can do in those moments, and this comes from many moments of having masculinity nostalgia, especially working with Department of National Defense, military is all about nostalgia. A lot of military identity is about an idea of what the military is, and the reality is very different. And so I think I wrote about masculinity nostalgia. I really think it's a concept that helps me understand the world. So as you can see, I'm animated about it. I think asking questions in that moment. So if someone says, oh, well, since we had DEI, we only hire, that was an equity hire. That's a great example of, it's kind of a masculinity nostalgia moment where it's talking about, we would have hired someone different if it wasn't for these policies. And that's a moment when you can ask a question. Well, what do you mean by that? What do you think it would have looked like? What part of the equity agenda has shaped that? What would it have looked? What kind of candidate? So it doesn't even have to be hostile, and certainly it's probably better if you can keep the hostility out. But just asking questions about when was that exactly? When if you think about the masculine nostalgia, I think often of politicians wearing high-vis vests and hard hats talking about, when men had all of these great working class jobs, and you want to ask, okay, tell me more about what is the time that you want to get back to? What does that look like? And what else was going on? So that would be my recommendation. It doesn't mean you're going to change the world in that moment, but I do think having the language of masculinity and nostalgia itself can help you feel less kind of crazy in those moments too. At least it helps me. So.
I think we have to talk about the $150 billion the Canadian government is planning to spend on the military. You know, $49 billion this year, then $150 billion in a couple of years. They're already proposing $1.7 trillion on fighter jets. All of these are gendered intersectional spending that is leading to the rise of the right wing because people can't afford homes. They can't afford groceries. The violence gets taken out and against women and kids in the home. And we go back regressively to the old concepts of what is going to win something, which is war. So I think we really, as peace activists, need to speak to these budgets, speak to the federal government, speak to our member of parliament, and we need to build a peace movement across this country that really exposes this. And there's many, many small peace organizations alive today, active today, and growing. And I think some of these issues are coming up in the NDP leadership debate, but we have to get these issues out there and demand their positions on this rapid militarization of space and the consequent environmental disasters that are occurring because of it.
Mayor, maybe just very quickly before we wrap up, I would recommend that if you're interested in the idea of policy coherence that we've heard, and a shout out to Tamara who is making me think of this, but we've just published in November the biggest edited policy analysis our network has ever done. It's almost 100 pages with 15 different chapters. Ellen and Tamara have a chapter about military spending. And much of it is about how we as civil society activists and those who straddle the word of both academic and activist perceive and analyze the way our government has implemented or not women, peace, and security commitments. And so I really recommend that you do take a read and take a look. It's free on our website. We have some little printed out QR codes if you're interested. But we have a lot of material that people can use for free, both in the Research Network on Women, Peace and Security website, on our Civil Society Network website. And so really, if you're interested in understanding more of these nuances, these are free and available to you. And we hope that you can use them in your own work as well. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much to everyone. We're just coming up to 6:30, and we have to let our dedicated staff go home at some point. So I'm just going to wrap up really quickly. Thank yous are always necessary at the annual Richard Splane Lecture. So let me start off with thanking our celebrities and dignitaries. Dr. Patsy George, thank you again for joining us. And Claire Prouston and our director, Leah Carragata. Also, huge thanks to our outstanding panelists for giving us lots to think about and providing us with a sad and firm grounding with the reality out there, but also ways we can fight back, we can organize, we can advance an agenda of equity and social justice. Many thanks to our organizing committee this year, Patsy, Samir, Lauren, Alyssa, Rachel, and Ritika, and we also have Josh here with us tonight. So thanks very much to our staff. And though Angela Marie MacDougall was unable to join us tonight, she asked me to tell you that she was here in spirit and to encourage us to continue to work tirelessly and with hope and with optimism for women, peace, and security. So finally, yes. I'll pass that on to her. Thank you. And finally, thanks to all of you, our group of active listeners. I always love a social work audience, but the United Nations folks seem to be just as active in their nodding and their close attentive listening. So thank you to all of you for joining us, and join us next year. Probably take money.